The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the slanted roof of the barn and turning the surrounding prairie into a blur of gray and brown. James McAllister rode slowly along the muddy track, his boots soaked, his coat plastered to his broad shoulders, eyes scanning the edges of the fields for anything that might stir. He had lived on this frontier long enough to know the subtle signs of danger, but tonight, the unease thrumming beneath his skin was different. There was something hidden, waiting, and it drew his attention to the dilapidated barn at the far end of the property. Its wooden walls sagged under years of weather, gaps between the planks leaking the storm inside like secret whispers. Inside, pressed against the corner, was a small figure, a young woman barely 23, with hair dark as raven wings plastered to her cheeks by the rain. Her dress, embroidered and delicate, clung to her like a second skin, wet and heavy. She flinched at every groan of the barn, as though even the wind could betray her presence. Mei Lin had fled for reasons that weighed on her chest like stones. An arranged marriage turned betrayal. The sting of isolation in a land that did not see her as human, only as a curiosity, a puzzle. Her wide eyes, dark and wary, flicked to the shadow of the approaching rider, calculating, trembling, and yet alive with a desperate hope that he might not be the danger she feared. James dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the mud, the smell of wet earth and hay mixing with the faint, acrid tang of smoke from a distant hearth. He did not rush. He knew the language of caution, of fear. "You need help," he said, his voice rough but not unkind, carrying a weight of experience and understanding. She flinched, pressing herself tighter to the wall. Her voice caught in her throat, words failing her as they often did in moments of fright. "And I need a wife like you," he added, his gaze steady, careful not to overwhelm her. There was no gallant flourish, no theatrical charm, just honesty, the raw and unpolished kind that life on the prairie often demanded. The rain continued, a persistent curtain that separated them from the world outside, a soft drum that seemed almost like a witness to the quiet exchange. James crouched slightly, hands visible, moving with deliberate care as he offered her a dry blanket from his saddlebag. She hesitated, suspicion etched into every line of her small frame, but the hunger in her eyes, the need for warmth, for safety, overcame the instinct to flee. The first act of trust was simple and small, yet monumental. She accepted the blanket. Days bled into one another under the unyielding rain, each one measured by the slow rituals of survival. James brought food, fresh bread, salted pork, hot water for tea, and the comfort of his presence. They worked in tandem, not as a couple bound by words, but as two souls learning the contours of one another's existence. He would sweep the wet hay from the barn floor while she tended the small fire he coaxed to life each evening. Their hands brushed in fleeting, accidental contact, leaving warmth that lingered long after the moment had passed. Mei Lin's initial fear softened with each gesture, each quiet smile that crept into the corners of her lips. Outside, the world was less forgiving. Townsfolk whispered behind curtains, their voices carried on the wind. "What's that girl doing with McAllister?" one would say. "Isn't she trouble?" Another would shake their head, judgment pressing down like the storm clouds above. Mei Lin felt the weight of their eyes even when they were not there, a reminder that her place in this land was fragile, tenuous. James, aware of the scrutiny, remained a steadfast presence, never once flinching or yielding. He did not speak of their critics. He shielded her with his silence and the quiet insistence of care, letting action speak louder than words ever could. Through the steady rain, an unspoken bond grew. It was in the shared labors of daily life, the careful milking of a cow, the hauling of water, the sweeping of straw, and in the silences that stretched comfortably between them. Mei Lin laughed softly, the sound rare but bright, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and James listened, hearing something he thought he had lost long ago. The barn, once a prison of fear and hiding, became a sanctuary, a space where past sorrows were acknowledged but did not rule. One night, the storm intensified, wind slicing across the prairie with a force that rattled the barn's fragile frame. James kept close, his arms steady at her back as the lightning flashed and the thunder rolled. Mei Lin clung to him, fear and trust mingling in her chest, the two emotions inseparable in their intensity. In that moment, words were unnecessary. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within, and through it, a clarity emerged. They were no longer two lonely souls passing through existence. They were anchors for one another, a promise made not in speech, but in unwavering presence. The storm subsided, leaving the earth slick and shimmering, the smell of wet grass and mud hanging in the air. James helped Mei Lin to her feet, and in a gesture deliberate yet gentle, he drew her into a careful embrace. It was not hurried or dramatic. There was no rush, no fevered passion, but a steady, grounding warmth, the kind that speaks of belonging and safety. Mei Lin rested her head against his chest, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, her breathing slowed. Her heartbeat no longer raced against the fear of being unwanted. By morning, the barn was quiet except for the soft drip of rain from the eaves. Outside, the prairie glistened under a hesitant dawn, the mud and water reflecting a world renewed. Their bond, tested by the storm and by the quiet trials of each day, had transformed into something more than survival. It was trust, and beneath that, the tender buds of love. In each other, they had found not just companionship, but a refuge, a sanctuary from the judgment and cruelty that had shadowed their lives. James and Mei Lin stepped out into the gentle drizzle together, boots sinking into the softened earth, hands brushing until they clasped naturally. The world, with all its gossip and scrutiny, seemed distant, inconsequential compared to the quiet triumph of finding another heart that mirrored your own. The barn, once a place of fear, now stood as a testament to patience, resilience, and the subtle power of quiet acts of grace. The narrator, an old soul reflecting on the prairie and its lessons, turns to the viewer with a soft, knowing tone. Sometimes life's storms arrive not to break you, but to show you how to shelter another's heart, how to open your own. In the rain, James and Mei Lin had discovered not only each other, but a shared strength, a life built on care, trust, and the gentle persistence of love. The story ends with their silhouettes moving slowly across the field, footprints mingling in the wet earth, leading forward into a future where hope and peace were no longer distant dreams, but lived realities. The prairie whispered its approval, the rain softened, and the barn, once a refuge of fear, remained a monument to quiet courage, the beginnings of a life filled with love measured in gestures, glances, and the slow, enduring pulse of two hearts learning to beat as one.